I'm really thrilled to be joined by Michelle Goldberg, who I'm sure most of you know is a columnist at the New York Times. And I think a really, really terrific columnist. I think writing that frequently is really difficult. And one of the reasons I think Michelle is really good at it, besides being very talented, is I actually think she puts a lot of work into her columns, which is something that I really, as a fellow writer, notice and appreciate because I just learn a lot more from her than I do sometimes from other columnists because she's actually reporting and gathering information. So, Michelle, I guess the kind of macro question I'd love to ask you about is I think there's always a danger for progressives in general, and me in particular, on this issue of Israel-Palestine, and not being able to distinguish the normative from the descriptive. There are things I would like to see happen in American politics, right? And so I'm always worried that I'm inclined to exaggerate how much the things that I want to see happening are actually happening. So I wonder how substantial you think the shift that's taking place in American politics on the question of Israel and Palestine is, and how likely you think it is to change the Democratic Party in terms of the person that the Democratic Party will nominate for president in 2028.
Well, so I don't think it's just wish casting on the part of people who want the
Right.
Democratic
That's the
Party
word.
more
Yeah.
left-wing direction to say that among younger Democrats, there's a sea change coming, right? I mean, if you look at kind of all the polls, and to be honest, not just among younger Democrats, because younger Republicans are also becoming more hostile to Israel for reasons that sometimes are like not as salubrious. But I just think young people in general look at what's happening there through an entirely different lens than the one that's been dominant in American politics. At the same time, I would imagine that the candidates in 2028 are going to be really, really cross-pressured because, there's still like substantial, just in terms of lobbying and the money that can be raised against you. I mean, we've seen several politicians, AIPAC has quite proudly taken them out and poured money behind their challengers. And there's also a way, and I guess this could change at a certain point, in which being pro-Israel becomes a sort of stand-in for being moderate more generally.
Yes. Yes.
And so candidates that are afraid that they will be seen as too unelectably left are going to need to prove their pro-Israel bona fides with some power brokers within the party. That said, I feel like there's been a real sea change just in like almost the last week. And so when you're talking about something that happens on such a short time horizon, it's really difficult to say how lasting it is. But as the starvation in Gaza has become so undeniable, you're even seeing people like Richie Torres,
Yes,
demanding a surge of aid. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're breaking with the pro-Israel consensus more broadly, but he has said something interesting, which is that he doesn't know if the rift between the Israeli government and the Democratic Party can be healed. And he put all the blame for that on Netanyahu, not on people to his left. And he's also defended Zoran Mamdani from some of the ugliest and most Islamophobic attacks on him. And that could be a matter of principle, but it could also, he's an ambitious politician in New York who may also see which way the winds are blowing.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I feel like in the mainstream media, the discourse in the last week has felt really different than it did before. There's less of a kind of a both sidesism, and a lot of people seem emboldened to say things very bluntly in a way they didn't before. I'm wondering why you think, I mean, yes, things perhaps are worse, but I mean, Israel had cut off aid for almost 3 months earlier this year. The ICC put an indictment for war crimes of starvation last November. Why do you think that this dam seems to have broken I mean, you know the media very, very well. What do you think explains this?
I think it's a couple. I mean, first of all, I do think that things are just much worse, And the thing about starvation is that there's a sort of tipping point, right? Like you can cut off aid and that might cause like immediate suffering, but the undeniable physical consequences just take some time to manifest. So that's part of it. I mean, part of it is just the images, and it's why there's been such a fight over this one particular image that the New York Times showed of this really emaciated child, that then they added more information that he actually had this, I think, neuroskeletal disorder that impeded his muscle growth. And this has been taken as evidence by defenders of Israel that this is all a hoax. But nevertheless, the image, I mean, when you look at, say, Donald Trump who now says the kids are hungry. Why does he say that? It's because of what he's seeing on TV. I think that, especially writers can sometimes underestimate how important visuals are. I mean, I don't think that Netanyahu does. I think that's why he's kept journalists out of Gaza. I think that was a big thing. I think
Yeah.
B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights coming out and calling Israel's war on Gaza genocide kind of legitimated people who maybe were coming to that conclusion on their own, but were very wary of being accused of anti-Semitism. So yeah, I think that it's all of those things building. And then there's a kind of tipping point sometimes that happens in the media that is almost a little bit alchemical. You can look at, say, the murder of George Floyd and say, why did that catalyze something that murder of Philando Castile didn't? It's very hard to say. There's just sometimes a spark that's hard to explain.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like partly it's right. It's that the media has a herd mentality in general, for good and for bad. But maybe in this issue in particular, there's like a strength in numbers because you say people, like particularly anchors on TV or whatever, might be worried about getting out in front of people too much and therefore being attacked as being anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. But once everybody's doing it, there's a greater safety for any one person.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. Nobody wants to be perceived as radical on this issue. But at a certain point, it's kind of, who are you going to believe, me or your own lying eyes? And there's also a sort of, I think, umbrage that journalists take at a certain point at being told that they're not supposed to report what is so obviously happening.
Yeah. There was someone put in the chat something about this interview that I did watch from Breaking Points with Alyssa Slotkin, the Michigan senator. And it is really striking to watch. It reminded me a bit of the Tucker Carlson interview with Ted Cruz, where you just are reminded what it looks like when a politician is really put on the spot. I mean, you and I have both spent over the years a fair amount of time on cable news and these kind of things. And it did make me step back and ask the question of, why is this so unusual that you have this kind of interview in which a politician is really pressed in ways that force them to confront really, really difficult issues on moral terms, and why isn't that routine on American television and American mainstream media?
Well, I mean, think about Mehdi Hassan, right? I mean, Mehdi Hassan was at MSNBC and was one of several Muslim anchors. There were several Muslim staffers at MSNBC who were sort of slowly not even necessarily taken off the air because some of them were still guest hosting, but were put on air much less during the initial stages of war in Gaza.
Ayman Mohyeldin,
Right. Basically, because the company was, I think, getting so much flack. I don't know who they were getting flack from specifically. And so I just think that everyone who covers this, for the most part, on mainstream television starts with a certain structure of assumptions and presuppositions. And the questions that they ask people kind of have to adhere to that. And some of those presuppositions are that the safety of Israelis is paramount. And it's not that the safety of Israelis isn't important, of course, but just that, the safety of Palestinians is important, but the safety of the Israelis is a priority. And it's why, often you'll find the easiest way to have discussions is to say, well, this even imperils the safety of Israel, or this imperils the future.
That's safer, right?
Yeah. And I think if you break from those conventions, it's not just that you risk backlash. It's not even clear that you can stay on the air. Although I think that's changing. I mean, I feel like Jon Stewart, for example, has been visibly anguished over this.
Yes, and maybe because, he's kind of his own brand in a way, maybe that gives him a kind of security that some random person on cable wouldn't have, in the sense that they are more easily replaceable with somebody else if they get out of line. This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.